There we go. And I will also go ahead and take roll for us really quickly. Oh, before I do that, I did reload our documents just a little while ago. I realized that I had not made the switch to 2022 yet. So I reloaded those documents with the correct year. Just a little while ago, I noticed that I was still living in 2021, so it's going to take me a little while to make that transition. And I'll go ahead and take roll for us. And if we have other people join, I'll get those updated quickly. So Carol.
I am here.
Lori. Stephen.
I'm here.
Sandra. David.
Here.
Lynette.
Here.
Jennifer.
Here. I think it was me. There's usually more than one.
See, Leanne is here. Mandy. Anna.
Here.
And Wendy is on the phone. Senator Powers.
I'm here.
Excellent. And Representative Whitson.
I'm here.
And this may be you, Senator Powers, who is on the call at the 931 phone number?
That's me.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I will go ahead and share my screen, and Brad, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ginger. Hey, guys, hope everybody's had a great new year so far. And Ginger, I think I speak for everybody that please don't ever let us see 2021 again. So we will gladly look forward to you making those date changes on 2022. So I hope you guys all had a restful and relaxing Christmas vacation and good New Year. Certainly excited to get started there. Forgive me, I'm going to be on and off camera. I'm having trouble connecting. So I certainly am here, as you can tell, but I may or may not be on camera. And I saw a couple other folks having some challenges there as well. But I wanted to go ahead and jump into this. Anna, you had sent an email. I wanted you to know I saw that. I was not ignoring you on purpose, was in another meeting when it hit, that we're going to go through this. So a lot of this we go through because it is being recorded to make sure folks know that we're following the same thing. So certainly want to be empathetic to what you're talking about with a lot of the PowerPoints and making sure that we get to discussion points. Anna or Ginger, if you don't mind, maybe moving on to the next slide as I'm kind of walking through some of this. So again, if you want to review some of the statements that we've had conversations around relative to what the BEP looks like and funding the generation of some of those funds and things like that, there's Lori jumping on. Please make sure, that you're kind of able to read that. And then Ginger, I'll stop there if you need to read through this, and then we'll certainly move on to the next slide and some other discussion points. I'll add a few key items there as well.
Okay, I will zip through this really quickly and get us onto the next part. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula.
I think that was record time, Ginger. Nice job.
We're all going to have it memorized by the end of this anyway.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, then as we're moving through this, you guys, what we'll do is Ginger can kind of give us some of the follow-ups for meeting 3. One of the things, Ginger, if you want to move on to the next slide, the one right after that, that I want to be, it's going to sound very direct. I want it to be direct, but respectful too. We did not get a lot of feedback. In fact, we barely got any feedback from the group relative to the last meeting, as far as some of the requests we made from the Excel spreadsheet around must-haves, nice-to-haves, maybe-haves, those types of things. We only have, as you can see on here, 3 meetings left, counting this one. And to really dive into this about what do the must-haves look like and kind of how do we want to prioritize, to Anna's comment about, some of really the meat of the subject and what we're hoping to see inside this conversation and inside the potentially the new funding mechanism
Thank
for
you.
the legislature and the governor's office to work on. So we're really under the gun now, to be very frank. Ginger and I were reviewing some of the documents that she sent this morning. To be very transparent and honest with you guys, we only received one bit of information back from the entire subcommittee. And I was really hoping that we were going to get a lot more, because we have obviously an expectation's been asked of Ginger and I from the Department of Education to provide real-time feedback back to them as we're having these conversations. So I'm hoping that today we can really challenge ourselves. Hey, no problem, Carol. That certainly, I didn't want it to come across as an indictment on anyone, just a reminder to us that we do have some action items together as a subcommittee that we need to share. And so I want to make sure, to your point, Anna, we really have to start dialing in today and in the next meeting. And really that last meeting is kind of just putting a bow on the gift to send back to DOE. So we're kind of under the gun now about creating some of those. Obviously, as Ginger just alluded to, we're all not going to agree on everything, but I'm hoping that there's some high level points at a minimum that we can come out from this meeting to say, we all agree that this might be a nice to have, or we all agree that these are must haves, because, the lens that we see it through can obviously impact that. So as we're going through some of this on the meeting number 4, 5, and 6, Ginger, I didn't know if you wanted to comment on any of those, or if there was anything relevant for the subcommittee to make sure that they saw inside this preview. So I'll stop for a second to let you respond or chime in if you need to.
The one thing that I would share with you guys here is that for meeting 5, you will get to see a draft of just sort of the framework, some of the components that are starting to surface for that new funding formula. There will be an opportunity prior to that for the public also to see that. So you all can see that beforehand. Public will get to see that as well. So some of those public comments that you'll have for meeting 5 will be around those components that will go into, or potentially go into, that funding formula. So you'll be responding to something that's a little more concrete at that point, a little more tangible, I guess, at that point. So I think our next meeting will be a little less, theory around the formula and moving to a space of a little more tangible. So expect that to happen between 4 and 5, and then 5 to be in response to, what we're starting to see flesh out based on the work that you guys and the other 17 subcommittees have been doing at that point. And then 6 will be based on how that's starting to shape out. What would be some of those policies that need to live with that formula to make it work? So I think that's an important thing for you all to know, that, the work in this call will help feed into that draft. No dollar amounts or anything will be associated with that draft that we see for that next meeting. It will just be about the component pieces.
Yeah, that's perfect. And another thing I think that piggybacks off of that nicely too, Ginger, is, Carol, to your point and to Lynette's point, we may want to go back and revisit with some of those other stakeholders to kind of accelerate that conversation. If we don't get, or if you don't get something from those respective groups this week, to really let them know that, we're under the gun here to get some of that feedback. And then Carol, hopefully you can pivot some of that feedback directly back to Ginger and Lynette from the council members too, to allow us to really get it inside that Google Drive. Because the other thing we're trying to balance too, to be honest, is We want folks to be able to speak their mind, but not to the point where they see something from somebody to say, no, I don't agree with that when it really needs to be this. We really want to see all of it where we can start having those discussions to say, yeah, that makes sense or that doesn't make sense. Because as Ginger alluded to, you can pretty much guarantee that not everybody's going to get everything, but hopefully some folks are going to get some things. So I'm hoping that, over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we can really zero in for that 5th meeting there in 2 weeks from today around, hey, these are our top 4 easily, that the vast majority of this subcommittee said these are must-haves for us, not nice to haves or maybes, but these are must-haves. Anna, go ahead.
Just a favor, I went back and looked and I did see where you sent that. If we can put maybe in the subject line, like action item or something, because we are getting so many emails from this committee. Just so we're not missing something and we know to look to the bottom if there is feedback. Just
Sure.
that would help me.
Yeah, no problem. No, we're happy to do that. And again, Ginger and I certainly want to make sure we're making it easy for you. And I really appreciate you guys reaching out to some of these other stakeholders. That's perfect right there, Lynette, what you said. I'm looking forward to seeing that. You guys better than anybody know how fast time flies by. And the fact that we're already, 60% through these meetings and they're going to be working through that proposal probably in February, really, identified to me, hey, we got to keep moving and trying to move forward. But we're certainly happy to do that. So Ginger, if you want to go ahead and jump to the next slide. And again, these are all things that are available to you guys. If you need this PowerPoint or if you need to see this, ask Ginger again. We're happy to send it. Like Jen, I know you just asked, can we resend it? We're happy to forward that back out too. So just some finalized supports and services here. Ginger, if you want to go through that before we move to the conversation points, make sure everybody's on the same page, and for those that are going to be watching the recording.
Yes, so for each of the areas of funding for the student-based funding formula, base, weights, outcomes, direct funding, we're thinking about those through this lens of must-haves, should-haves, nice-to-haves, and long shots. So as you think about the things that you would like to see within the student-based funding formula, you're thinking about it in those bigger buckets: base, weights, outcomes, direct funding. But also within that, what are those must-haves within the base? What are those must-haves for the weights and so on? And then what would be the things that you would like to see in there that should be in there, but maybe it's not an absolute have to have. And you could see that shifting to a should have. So if you think about that from a perspective of if we had to fight for something, this is something that absolutely has to be there. And if it was something that you were able to say, okay, if I had to give something up, I would be okay with this one being the thing that, I could let go of. And maybe that be the should have part. I'd really like to see it there, but if push come to shove, I could let this go. And that might help you think about what would be the must have versus the should have part, or if it's not funded as much as you would like for it to be funded, but it is in some way there. That might be another way to think about that. Nice to haves are, of course, a thing to think about. Is it's not essential, but it is something that would be helpful to districts. And then long shots are those things that may be like way down the road, but something that you don't really foresee being there. But, hey, it would be great if you could include this somewhere along the way.
And just one of the other things to bring up that was shared with me too, and I know this group's done a really good job in targeting this specifically around IEPs and some other federal requirements and mandates, specifically around the must-have. Not concern's not the right word, but one of the things that we've been asked to be cautious of on the must-haves, make sure that we're able to provide legally some of that background about why it's a must-have. Hey, the Fed said in 1995, something like that, because when you have 17 subcommittees and they're all going to submit 10 must-haves, that becomes 170, and there's no way that they're going to be able to filter through that. So for the must-haves that we know of, let's make sure that we get semi-granular on those, where we can say based on federal law and some of the things that we've talked about. And if we can't do that, we need to give some consideration to say really important or should have because of XYZ, impact on students, impact on school districts, impacts on communities, whatever that looks like. And I think we've done a pretty good job in identifying some of the must-haves that are legal requirements, that are federal mandates, things like that, that we've got an obligation to make sure that they don't forget about as we're putting them in there, and not just having must-haves in there because that's something we believe that there's got to be substance behind it as far as legal things. And that's something that we've been pushed on from the committee leadership to make sure that we're identifying. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Ginger, were you going to say something? I saw you raise your hand. I think you were coughing now that you said that. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So here's the base. Again, we've talked about this, a lot of the things that we've discussed and that have been discussed. Are there any other areas inside here right now that we would want to talk about? Hey, this is something that's a base point of our discussion, and making sure that this is reciprocated in every other area that we're talking about, that foundation includes some of these things. I know some of the folks from other school districts and other subcommittees have mentioned a lot of their focus being around here. But I want you guys, if you haven't had a chance to look at this, go ahead and look through this real quick to see if there's anything that collectively as a group we want to add. And if there's anything, honestly, that we see on here to say, hey, that's a nice to have. And yes, it's a base, but not a base that we necessarily need to focus on as much as we might some of the others. So I'll kind of pause there, let you guys look at it, and look for hands to be raised if there's anybody that's got comments or feedback to add to this section.
This is Lynette, and this is where I get in my own head confused in thinking about the base, because so many of the base items also in my mind will flow into the weights for students with disabilities. When I think about technology, when I think about the role as a counselor or a school psychologist might play. So do I just need to purely compartmentalize those types of things and not worry about that a student with a disability may have additional needs for technology or nurses or that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I want to chime in before Ginger maybe jumps in. I think, actually, to be honest, Lynette, I think it helps strengthen the argument. So when we're looking at the base, it creates a foundation to say, I don't think you're going to meet a parent, or maybe you will, that will say, hey, more nurses is a bad thing. But I think it creates a base for us to say, not only are nurses important, but our medications our children have, they're not allowed to be given by I think it helps build the argument for us when we use that base as the foundation. So when we go through it specifically for students that are gifted or students with disabilities, I think it's natural for us to look at it through that lens and then build our argument about why those are must-haves. Because yeah, nurses are great if you've got a traditional or a typical child that has a fever, but if you've got one of our children, their G-tube becomes undone, or they're having seizures, you guys know, I mean, I don't want to keep harping on it, but I think we build in the argument from the base. And so it's great for us to look at it, but I don't want us to lose sight of saying, okay, how do I build my story for children with disabilities and children that are gifted from this base recommendation that DOE has created around local needs with rural access and technology for students that might need better internet and things like that. So Ginger, am I off base there? I don't think I am, but I want to make sure Ginger has a chance to provide some feedback or even, disagreement, which is healthy too.
No, I think it is thinking about what are those needs for students with disabilities, gifted students, that would also be needs for all students, because this base is funding for all students. So what are those resources that you all can identify from that lens of students with disabilities, gifted students, that we would want to make sure make it into this base funding? So when we think about sustainability for technology, that's something we need to see for all students. And then there's also, to your point about the weights part, that's a place where there is additional funding that is happening over there to ensure that, based on the different services that are needed, based on those additional resources, more funding is provided if it's a students with disabilities and they're provided X services, they're getting additional funding, or a rural district or what have you. So there could be some components here, like maybe you all say, we agree with all 5 of these, wholeheartedly agree with all 5 of these, but we would also add these things.
Yeah.
Or we agree with 4 of these 5 things. We don't agree with this one.
Yeah. And Anna, let me say something real quick before I jump to you. And I think she nailed it right there. I think, Lynette, about how we build off that base to say, yeah, we agree with all of the base. And in fact, we agree so much. Here's what we think are the must-haves from nurses and technology, sustainability. You know, communication devices are must-haves in every school, or speech therapists. Stuff like that. So I think there are arguments that we can build off of this base. But again, as Ginger said, we're also not married to just 5 bullet points either. If this group collectively believes there needs to be 10 on there, then we need to put that down there, but have, really compelling reasons why to add it as a base, because that base is creating all the other funding for all the other subcommittees too. So Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I like what's here and listed, but I do want to pull out, I think we could do an additional bullet point for our screening. So we do know that under RTI2, that does cover a lot to get into those tiers. We do have a dyslexia law that does right now currently impact 44,000 of our Tennessee students. They're getting that intervention there under that general education. And also we do have gifted kids who are in our kind of encore gifted programs that aren't necessarily rising up to having an IEP. So I think in this space, we do need to include something for that general ed screening to kind of get that first tier of students before they're advancing to students with disabilities, for just general kind of gifted school programs, and students with screening for students with dyslexia to pair with that dyslexia law.
Sure. And I think that's a great point to add to there, because typical students may be screened as they're coming in from a preschool program or something. So this isn't out of line of what many students in Tennessee are already going through anyways. I think that's a great point. Hey, Lori, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just going to say, I agree with Anna on, on the dyslexia law and it being, state law. And also reading literacy has to be one of the base things that we focus on. I mean, all this other stuff is great, but if our kids can't read, we're missing the point. I will say I have heartburn with the 5th point, the flexibility for local needs. I find that LEAs aren't capable of properly defining their local needs without direction from the state. That might sound harsh, but it's the truth. Middle school CTE is a really nice to have. I've had 2 kids go through middle school, and it is sort of the abyss of nothingness, but compared to reading, it's not a priority. Financial literacy, the same thing. It's definitely, we should do it. It'd be really nice to have, but compared to literacy, it's not the priority in my mind. But again, that letting the LEAs kind of dictate how they spend those funds doesn't work well in my assessment. They need more direction from the Department of Education.
And I can give just a little bit of context for that piece that may help with some of that. And it is that based on the demographics of the district, some of them may already have, like a principal is a good example. There's a large number of districts where a principal is not fully funded currently, but in other districts they already are, based on how funding works. And so for some districts, they would need to go ahead and fund those principals, but in another they would not. Similar for the assistant principal situation. And so looking at how do we ensure that those districts who need to have some of those positions funded can fund those positions when they're needed, and then others where it's already funded, they can use those funds in another high need area. So I think that's kind of where that flexibility is, coming in, is to say, here are the things that these funds could be used for. And if you're already funding, if this is already funded, here are the other things, where those funds are generated from. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I just want to kind of provide some of that context for that flexibility piece.
I understand. I can tell you what Clarkson Montgomery County school systems will do is they'll invent 20 more central office staff that they can manipulate into one of those buckets because they do that every day. And it still won't go to the students. And my priority is that dollars be spent directly on the students and directly on the teachers. You know, and again, as I mentioned in the last call, you know, counselors and school psychologists are definitely needed, but they also need to be properly trained and not function under the current understanding that they have.
Yeah. Good feedback. Thanks, Jen. Then we'll go to David.
I guess I have a question based on what was just discussed on that last bullet. So in parentheses, there's some suggestions. Are those just ideas and then the schools can kind of come up with their own? Or if so, I feel like there's a lot missing that maybe should be in the base. Like I'm surprised transportation and building infrastructure type stuff isn't in the base funding.
Yeah, it is. Those are a lot of the hot points, and I think Ginger can talk to it, but that's not just what it's limited to. I think the idea was those are a lot of the main conversation points around local needs. But I think inside you can add other things that might be included in there as far as flexibility for local needs. Ginger, am I misunderstanding that? I don't think I am, but because I think there's flexibility that's built in there, right?
Oops, I just muted and unmuted myself. So the things that are currently funded in the BEP formula would continue to be funded or be brought into this new funding formula. So things like the transportation piece, like that would be brought forward into this new funding formula. So that would be included there. These local needs, the things that you see listed there in parentheses, are the things that have come up as like those local needs and have surfaced throughout the feedback as, you know, consistently we're hearing these things as areas that need to be funded and are ones that are based on what local needs are. And so some districts have these as a need, others already have them funded. And so those have just consistently been brought up. I think districts would have some flexibility within that to decide which direction they need to go based on what needs are popping up. As far as additional flexibility outside of that, I think those things probably would be more for a policy discussion later versus like component discussion right now.
Okay.
Does that help, Jen?
Yeah.
A little bit. I mean, whether you agree or not, it's different, but that
Right.
gives some context to it, I guess. David Martin.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back on the flexibility issue. I think we need to be very careful in making blanket statements that districts aren't aware of their needs and aren't able to effectively use their funds because I think that there may be one one experience in Clarksville, Montgomery County, but our state, based on, I work with superintendents and districts across the entire state, and each one of them have very unique needs based on their demographics, their socioeconomic, their tax base and everything else that comes along with that. So I think flexibility is important. I do believe we have to watch that, though. I mean, I think that there needs to be guidelines for anytime we attach money to things. There needs to be guidelines in which that is utilized. But I think it's very important in a state that is diverse as Tennessee that we don't discount the need for flexibility there. And then I'd also like to go back up to the school-based supports system. I think one of the things that's very applicable to obviously our population are those school psychologists. And if we're able to fund those at the recommended ratios, that's going to help out immensely when you have to, do evaluations and things like that on students because, we have those psychologists are charged with making sure those evaluations and making sure we're getting valid data to best support those kids. And so I think that it's very important in that school-based, in that base formula that we are funding those correctly because it's going to be crucial to making sure our students get the services that they need.
Yeah, and I think that's probably going back to what Anna was talking about around, that the evaluations for students. Anna, we'll go to you in a second. Leanne had her hand up. Go ahead, Leanne.
The flexibility for the very local needs. I agree with both aspects there. I think there are some that are, I don't want to say clueless, but they could be clueless. I think a lot of it has to do with perceived need and how those in leadership perceive the needs that are out there. Some of us, they have a dyslexia law. They need to stop whining about dyslexic children needing more services, or they have this, or they have that, or gifted students are this. So there's a perception there based on what they think the needs might be. So I think we do need that flexibility, but I also think we need some expectations within that flexibility. I think it was Anna had mentioned the Encore program, which if you're not familiar with that, that is a program for very high achieving students. And I believe it's in Metro Nashville. Am I correct? That's above that, then they have students that come in, gifted students that come in with IEPs. We need to keep in mind, Metro Nashville, the bigger districts, the well-funded districts, they have Clue, they have Encore, they have Spectrum. Those districts that do not have that size or financial backing, they've got nothing. So it's, you get what every gen ed class teacher student gets, or there's nothing. So if you're gifted, you have an IEP because that's the only way you're getting anything else. So we need some of that flexibility to cover some of those students who aren't getting those things. And if I can skip down a slide into weightedness, I think that's maybe where that maybe plays more into where we want to put some weights in there. And I don't know if we can weight based on what districts provide or not, but it seems to me like a district like Lake County or Unicoi County or these smaller districts, they're going to need more financial help for an enrichment program, the RTI, for high achieving students than are the metros and the bigger districts, because they've already got that program in place. So as we're thinking about, maybe we need to put some weights based on those things.
Yeah, no, great point. Certainly appreciate that feedback too. I think for the most part, Ginger, you can move to the next slide. I think we've weighed in on this. I don't want to assume for Anna, but real quick, just one thing to add. Go ahead and move to that next slide for me, Ginger, if you don't mind. I think one of the things too, to your point, Leanne, there was as we were going through some of these weighted areas with most positive feedback, students with disabilities and gifted students was number 2. I mean, it was right there. And to be honest, I think most of that was from students with disabilities and probably less of that was on gifted students, because there's either a thought process or an inadvertent bias around, well, gifted students are going to be fine. We don't have to worry about them. We need to worry about students with disabilities who can't communicate without a device, those things. So there might be opportunities for us to target that a little bit, to your point, and other folks that have brought that up. We've got a real opportunity here, given where the most positive feedback occurred was really in our subcommittee. So, Anna, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead and jump in and chime in there.
Real quick, I love everything everyone else has said, but again, I just really want to push on that. Our school psychologists are very important, but they typically are the gatekeepers for all of this, and they're not educated about giftedness. They are not educated about dyslexia. So that really has to, there has to be training provided there.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think, to your point, I think David brought that up, and then right there I just saw Mandy. I didn't even see you wrote that, but I was checking the chat. The IEP becomes, well, the only way we can do it is if they get an IEP. Instead of that being the culture, it becomes the exception to that. And I think what we're all collectively trying to get is there needs to be a natural culture there for all students, and not just students that might have an asterisk or an exception next to it. And the IEP then becomes, well, it's good enough because they've got an IEP, so that's the only way we can do it. We're really trying to build a culture here too around how do we serve every student. Does that mean the dollars move with them? Does that mean resources move? What does that look like? So as we move next to this next slide, this is really the meat of it right here. And this is what Anna was talking about. Anna, do you want to say something before I moved on?
I don't have access to the chat and I feel left out.
Oh, you should. So up on the top, you should see where it says leave and then an arrow to share content, then a microphone and a camera if you're on Microsoft Teams. If you keep moving to the left, there's a little chat bubble, almost like a text message box.
I've done a lot of messaging. Anyway, it's not here. That's fine. I'll just have to say it all out loud.
Okay, that's all right. That's why we're doing that too. So on this page for unique learning needs, obviously we were very high on the positive feedback, I think, which is incredibly important for us. But this is really now where the rubber meets the road. So Ginger, if you maybe want to talk a little bit about some of what our expectation or hope is around information we're going to receive from Carol's group and from, I apologize, I forgot who else said that. Lynette, I think it was you that said you were working with the council on feedback. If we want to talk a little bit here about some of these priority areas and maybe Ginger, really what next steps need to be in the rest of this meeting, but most importantly over the next 2 weeks to get you documentation, I think this would be a good place to start.
Yeah, so what we'll do with the feedback that you guys are sharing back is really look at where is the group as a whole showing that which items are coming out as really the majority saying these are the priorities. When we think about both the base, which is the list that I sent you guys, but if you all, what you're seeing on your screen right now are those weights, but which we can talk about today. If are we in agreement on all of these base items? I think based on conversations you all have had so far, I think the students with disabilities and gifted ones, tying those to tiers of cost seem to resonate with you guys for that, including dyslexia as one of the areas to ensure is part of the weight. Also seems to be something that is resonating with you all as well. So
I think we need to change that to characteristics of dyslexia to tie it to our law, because otherwise I think it's confusing. So I would change that on the weight. It really needs to be characteristics of dyslexia. So just for just
some clarification. I will add that to my notes and send that over. So I think as far as kind of assignments between now and our next meeting, it's really taking the feedback you're getting from the groups and from yourself, looking at your list from the last time and really deciding, do you agree that that item should be a must-have for the base, or do you actually see that in another area, or do you see that as a nice to have? Because what we have so far is really more of a brainstorm list. It's all of the things that have surfaced, but we really haven't prioritized that to say, yes, this is an absolute, and this is a, yeah, that'd be great, but I'm okay if this has to shift off. So really taking that, all of the things that you all send over and seeing what surfaces for the group. And next time we can say these are, we really don't have to discuss these because everyone was pretty much in agreement. Can we put this forward and you all agree on the call formally on the recording that these are the must-haves? And then the things that don't have as much are the things that we can then discuss as a group and decide, do we actually want to shift those to a must-have, or we're okay with those living as a should-have under the base? Does that make sense?
One of the things, and Ginger, if I can, as you guys are looking at that, a couple of things I want to add to what Ginger just said. So if you'll recall, I've got the Excel sheet pulled up on my screen right now. We had over 20 different topics, ideas, however you want to describe it, that we really need to start whittling down as we're going through some of this feedback that we're getting back from stakeholders. And one of the other areas that I want us to really be cautious or be careful on is I think it was column, I don't remember which column it was, might have been column, I'll have to go back and find it. Is there a must-have? Is this a must-have to be funded? But some of the feedback we were going to receive was not that it was a must-have, that it was or should have, but they need to have money in there for it. So we need to make sure we're being really consistent in the must-haves, that we're saying, hey, we think funding really needs to be in there. And even for some of those that you've got that are like, hey, that's a nice to have, or we don't really need that, think about that through in the funding too. If there's ways that you can make an argument to say, hey, we don't really need it, but it might be nice to have the dollars in there for folks that do, or ways to utilize those dollars for things that might be nice to have. I think that's going to be incredibly important too. So just to kind of recap real quick, just to give you guys some ideas, again, school psychologist was one of the topics we brought up, additional paraprofessionals, curriculum to support gifted learners, gifted endorsed educators, vision and audio specialists, students with characteristics of dyslexia that Anna just talked about, a designated gifted coordinator in all of the state level and at the State Department of Education that has endorsements. So there's a lot of different things. Like here's one that we talked about: early funding for children to build a strong foundation, but not as much funding later. So what does that look like in a funding plan now? Do you pull money back from that student when they're in 6th grade, or should that money stay with them until you can confirm that there's growth there? Like a lot of nuances to it, but just things to remember kind of as we're going through that, as we see things. One of the things that I'm going to ask you to do, if you can, I don't know, I know a couple folks were driving, was if you don't have that information pulled up that Ginger sent from the Google Drive, pull that Excel sheet up or those topics up, as we've got really only about 15 minutes. And I'd like to try to see if as we're looking at that, there's a pretty good consensus on a couple, maybe a must-haves that we can get to Ginger now to say, hey, we all agree that school psychologists need to be funded. There needs to be more of them, whether we're gifted or students with disabilities or whatever, a couple of those things. So if you have access, pull that up as we're kind of going through this, and maybe look at some of those high level ones that we can look at, because, to be fair, there's going to be differences of opinion on, how do we do things for students with disabilities, for students with gifted needs, and maybe those are things we talk about later. But I think there's a couple things we can look at where we say, hey, these are must-haves. We're not even talking about it until you guys agree with us at DOE that this should be including in the funding. So if you get a chance, pull that up. And I do want to ask that kind of to kick it off out of the gate. Is there anyone that doesn't think school psychologists would be or should be a must-have for students with disabilities or students that are gifted? Anna, were you raising your hand to agree or disagree, or was it something else?
I think this is helpful if you read them out. That document is very hard to see because it's so small. So I think if you could just read them out, and maybe we could do a raise of hands or something, because it's hard enough for maybe the people who are driving.
Yeah, it's a good point. And to be honest, not that I'm skipping anything, but the ones that are less likely, I think, to get a full consensus, we're probably going to skip that. Like, gifted endorsed district coordinator. There might be value in that for some, there might not be in others. School psychologist is fairly a generic one. I think regardless of disability or gifted, folks, I think, can talk about it. So the first one, to your point, was recommendation from our committee that we would follow the nationally recommended ratio for funding for school psychologists. And part of that actually became another topic was conversations around characteristics of dyslexia, and maybe not qualifying it under the school psychologist part, but school psychologists themselves would stand alone. So just by a raise of hands, anyone, do you think that's a must-have for students with disabilities or gifted students? I can see Carol. If you can raise it on the actual chat, that would help for Ginger too. There we go. I see more and more hands coming up. I'm slowly waiting before I kind of close the bidding here. Yeah, I mean, we're just at about everybody, Ginger. So that would be one I think that we could identify as a must-have. And then Lynette, I think you and Carol are probably going to see feedback that's going to echo that. I think that's probably going to happen anyways, is a lot of what we're bringing up as parents and stakeholders. I think these folks in the council and Carol's folks are probably going to just give us, good feedback. I think it'd be good to let us know, hey, we're on the right path, because other people said this too, that weren't even, in our meeting. So I think that's a good thing. See, here's another one that I think's a balance that Representative Whitson and others are going to have to deal with. Fully staffed schools and increased pay. Well, that might look different. I think everybody wants that, but it could look different. So you can say it's a must-have, but we don't know what it looks like for other districts and some of those folks. But I'm going to skip right down to the next one that I think tied into what we were just talking about, was providing an adequate number of school nurses. But how do we define adequate? Does each elementary, middle school, high school, magnet school, whatever that look like, does each one of those schools need a nurse? Or if it's a smaller community and they're a campus setting, can a nurse be at the elementary school and they have to run across to the middle school? I think that gives us some opportunity there to have that discussion. So I do want to touch on that one. Is there consensus from the group that every school needs to have a nurse? And I'll say, hey, raise your hand if you think so, back in that chat for me, if you don't mind. And Ginger, I don't know how many schools that would be. Do you know off the top of your head how many total schools are in the state of Tennessee that would qualify for a funded nurse? I'm just curious. I
Don't know off the top of my head, no.
Okay, because I don't know, what the cost equivalent is at. So on that one, it's interesting because, whoops, go ahead.
I
I'm sorry,
I also think it would be difficult to, to find that many nurses and to be competitive in the pay versus, private sector and public sector and all that stuff. That would be very difficult. I think you really have to tie it to a student ratio.
Yeah, and here's what's in, and Sam, I think that was you. Give me 1 second, then we'll go to Representative Whitson. So Carol put nursing was must have. So what's interesting on this was right now it's running about 50-50. Is that a must have or a should have? And those are one of those things where we would probably look at it after you get feedback, Lynette and Carol, from some of your folks to say, hey, we were kind of split on it, but a lot of the feedback we got from the community was they were saying, that's not even a conversation piece. That's something.
If I can just offer a minute, Brad, I think
Sure.
that, I would say ideally every school would have a nurse. I think that's probably not realistic. Just, so I think it probably is about a ratio.
Yeah.
And I think that a ratio of school nursing, and from what we're getting so far from our folks, is that school nursing for safety and for, all other manner of things ought to be at an appropriate ratio. It's probably not one per school because it's not possible.
Sure.
However, I think there's also some real energy in our community to think about the fact that in addition to that, putting some nursing in the base, that it ought to be a weight based on population for kids who have special health care needs, for example. So if you've got a school or a system that has a large number of kids who have epilepsy, who take medication, or have tube feeding, or any range of things, right? That ought to go into there ought to be a nursing weight in addition to a nursing base.
Yep. Yeah, great. It's a great point, because you might have a rural school that has less children that might have medical needs like that they might not be able to afford a nurse at every school because they've got 25 elementary schools. I don't know. And I think David was kind of touching on that too. Representative Whitson, did you have something to add too? I saw your hand up.
Right. Thank you, Brad. Yeah, Carol makes a very good point, but I have some information from previous legislation I can send to you that has the number of schools and some recommended ratios, and I'll get that to you.
Yeah, that would be incredibly helpful if Ginger could get that too, because I think, Lynette, you said it yourself, like who defines adequate, right? Like, is that me? Is that Commissioner Schwinn? Is it the governor? Is it who is it? And that might give us a baseline there from Representative Whitson to say, wow, I didn't know we had that many nurses. I mean, maybe there'll be more than I realize we have, or there might be less, and we're all, arguing the same point the right way to say, hey, this just confirms we don't have enough. Anna, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, quick question, because I know if we're going to do that categories like you sent, like Ohio did, for example, different categories, it's really hard with OHI, because like my daughter's epilepsy falls under OHI, that you don't know if that's just ADHD or if there was a medical need tied to that. So that's a little tricky just from your IEP to necessarily know. But I love what Carol was saying about, I hope we could all agree that a nurse should be in that weight, very much so. But again, how to get to that nitty gritty of pulling that information from an IEP, I think is a little bit harder.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking through after Carol said that, because I was trying to figure out, but again, Anna, like I would challenge the group to say, that might also go back to where David was, why we need more school psychologists to do evaluations to say, hey, we know this school has a population of 17% that might have complex needs or needs that require a nurse, other than that school across the road that has 4%, and so maybe, all these things I think are tied in like tentacles anyways. And Carol brings up a good point about that maybe there's got to be ways that we can try to blend that to say, look, we know that we're not going to get a school or a nurse at every school, and physically that's not possible. But how do we confirm that by saying the data also bears that out to say we don't need it at this school, but we sure as heck need it at this school? So I think there's some things that maybe we can tie into that too, that you're right about that. And one of the things a couple people too, Ginger, this is kind of an action item for you and I that a couple folks asked. the Excel spreadsheet, we might need to give more description in like, what does audiologist mean, or what does professional development for all special population educators mean? Is it certifications? Is it things like that, to really allow Lynette and Carol and some of the other folks that are going to stakeholders to be able to talk about what is curriculum to support gifted learners? Is that more focus on this? Is it less focus on that? And really help us kind of define that. Yeah, that's what Jen was just talking about, that the document Wendy sent out. And so we'll make sure we keep adding to that column too, so you guys don't just see RTI and you're like, well, what in the world does that mean? Or how do, what does that look like? So we'll make sure that we add some of that too. Now it gets a little bit tricky because some of the ones that we added at the bottom were probably not necessarily ones that fall in the must-haves, like differentiated compensation, maybe. Who defines that, right? Like Lynette kind of asked that, like a high need area, how is that defined? Is that defined by an area with poverty? Is that defined by an area of location? Socioeconomic factors, what does that look like? Professional development for all educators and general educators, how is that defined? Who does that? Who's required to do it? Is there pay attached to that? Just some things to think about. One of the other things, there was one other one I wanted to look at real quick. We've got about 6 minutes, which is crazy. This flies by, Anna. No wonder you sent that email to say, hey, an hour is not an hour in these conversations, more like 15 minutes. One of the other things that I wanted to cover real quick was, I just lost it. I apologize, and I'm trying to go back and find it. Vision specialists and audiologists. Are those the two areas that we wanted to focus on, or did we want to expand that to say medical professionals or therapists that might not be traditional, like vision and audiology might be core ones, but are there other therapies that you're aware of that more and more students need, whether it's behavioral therapy for students with autism or develop, something like that, where I also don't want us to pigeonhole where we just say vision and audio, and we're missing 50% of the children that might be on the autism. Does that make sense? So maybe think about that too a little bit as we're doing vision and audio there, Ginger, that we're really talking about flexibility for the state and districts to have in identifying areas of need based on professional therapists. Yeah, that's right there. I think what you just said, Carol, was, what's a wide range there of professional services, and can districts have flexibility to define that, or are parents aware of maybe what districts are responsible for and the funding that's tied to that? And I hope I didn't ramble too much for you guys not to get my point. I think I made it, at least in my head, it sounded good. So I'm sorry if I didn't verbalize that clear, but yeah, there you go, David. Some of those things like wraparound services, a lot of different things that historically we might not have thought about outside of just vision and audio. So I'll kind of stop there. We got about 5 minutes, and I want to see if there's any other comments. Anna, I'm going to say this not in a mean way. Your hand's up. Did you raise it, or was it up from the last time? I don't want to skip you if it was just stuck from the last time.
Voice. If anyone else wants to go ahead first, I can hold my comment.
Okay, so we'll wait on Anna. Is there anybody else on feedback or anyone else that wants to provide feedback to Ginger? And we've had a couple chair meetings, just so you know. Commissioner Schwinn is on all of them. They're taking this really seriously, which I'm really happy about. And hopefully we'll get some good feedback. Lynette, go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the things on the spreadsheet that I think might be helpful to look at, like the first one, additional paraprofessionals, educational assistants, and an increase in pay. I see those as two separate line items. If we're having to go through here and say what we need more paraprofessionals, but it would be really nice to have an increase in pay. Like, and then that sort of stalled me out on the spreadsheet too. There's a couple of places in there when it's the same subject, but it really is two different votes.
Yeah, sure. No, that's good. And Ginger and I could look at that, because there was another one too. So if you see that one, and then 2 or 3 spots below that, it says fully staffed schools and increased pay. Well, that's what we just said in line 4, increase in pay, but maybe for those folks. So you're right. I think there might be some areas for Ginger and I to look at to say, hey, we're going to split some of these. And again, if you guys, I want to also put it on you, if you see ones in there that need to be split, don't just count on Ginger and I to do that. Get it back to us to say, hey, I really think this is important enough that these are 2 topics, not one, that we've blended for space reasons or whatever. So great point there. We got about 2 minutes, and if you want to be the caboose here, you can kind of bring us home.
Ooh, absolutely. One thing I do think, as we're kind of going through and taking this quick vote, I would love us to make sure to put that characteristics of dyslexia as a must-have, because again, it is tied directly to state law. We're doing annual reports, we're reporting to the legislature, and we have about 5% currently of all Tennessee students are receiving this, and the department assumes that it's closer to 10%. So that's between 44,000 and 96,000 students. So I would love that to just go on the list of maybe take a quick vote on, since that is directly tied to a law.
Sure. Yeah, we can certainly do that. Yeah, so back to what Anna was just saying was around characteristics of dyslexia, adding that as a must-have around that conversation. You want to rephrase it, Anna, so Ginger can jot that down so I don't butcher it on what you're talking about.
I would just love us all to agree that it is a must-have that we fund, Lori, help me out, screening and for characteristics of dyslexia.
Yeah.
So it is a screening issue.
The screening and appropriate intervention.
Yep. Tied directly to say dyslexia law.
Yeah. And maybe by default, for Senator Powers and Representative Whitson and others in the legislature, that creates the understanding about why more school psychologists are needed or evaluations, because it ties into this law about characteristics of dyslexia. So I do think there's some value in there. So we certainly are not a dictatorship. So I'll make sure I'll open that up. If you want to raise your hand around what Anna and Lori just said as far as evaluations and characteristics of dyslexia, we'll see. We'll check on that feedback. And there really is no pressure, guys. I know everybody's looking at each other. Don't vote your conscience almost. I mean, if there are things that you think you should advocate for, do it. If you don't agree, that's okay too. If we all got along, it would be really boring.
Talk more about it. I just thought that one's easy since it's directly tied to a law. Can kind of take it off the table.
Yeah. Well, it looks like it looks like just about everybody there. So we can add that one. Ginger, you and I can add that one too around the must-have. So great. I appreciate that, guys. I certainly want to honor your time again. Appreciate everybody. I know you're all busy. I know Senator Powers and Representative Whitson are getting ready to come back into legislative session. Appreciate your time on this. Appreciate your investment, your engagement in this. I don't know where it's going to go or what it's going to look like, but I certainly know for our group, it's not for lack of effort and focus on really wanting what's best for every child across the state of Tennessee. So I appreciate you guys, what you're doing. Ginger, you want to wrap us up before we go?
Yes, so let me just recap quickly before I lose you guys on the must-haves that I'm going to go ahead and send through as recommendations. And those are school psychologists at the national recommendation ratio or recommended ratio, school nurses, and right now we're just going to leave it at the an adequate ratio and then define that more later as we get more information, but we don't want to lose that one. And then screening and appropriate intervention for students who have characteristics of dyslexia. And then we also have the related professional services, so vision specialist, audiologist, OT, PT, professional therapist, etc. Do I have all of those captured correctly? Okay, nice. And then it also, say that again, I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody.
That was just a yes.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And then I also just made a note that we kind of have a split on that flexibility on local needs. There's agreement that addressing local needs is important, but some parameters around that flexibility is really needed. Does that accurately represent what you all discussed, or is that something you would rather me not put in our feedback to the overall funding process? Oh, Lori, you're talking, but you're on mute. I think you're talking to us.
Let me see if I can unmute Lori. I can't. Lori, you're still on mute. And I'm not sure if Lori can hear us either. Can you guys hear us? Okay, perfect. I saw a couple heads not. Lori, I'm sorry, you're still on mute and we cannot hear you.
See if I can unmute her.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking to see if I can unmute her on.
I can't either. For some reason, I can't unmute her either.
Yeah, I think it's because we're all participants and not necessarily owning. Yeah, I can't unmute her. Lori, I'm sorry about that. If you can email, if you can hear us, maybe what you were going to suggest, but
So I
yeah.
will take that out and then we can discuss that later. That way I'm not sending anything that's inaccurate. Because I feel like Lori has something really important to share and I don't want to send anything that's inaccurate. And then for the weights, it sounds like based on the conversation, we're the two areas that we would see as highest priority for the weights part would be those students with disabilities and gifted, funded based on the tiers, and then the characteristics of dyslexia. We want to have that updated. Where right now it just says dyslexia on there. So we want to have that updated to that. But those would be the two highest priority weights that we saw on that list that is surfacing across all of the subcommittees and other feedback from stakeholders. So is that accurate?
Yep. That's
all right. So I have resent that spreadsheet to you guys earlier, but we'll make some updates to that. We'll remove some of these things we've already talked through. So that's a few less rows, but then we'll split some other things out. So we'll be adding some other rows back in. So you may or may not have fewer items to look at.
What you said, I couldn't figure out, is that, can we edit that directly in the document?
You can absolutely just edit on that document and you can send it back over and we'll share that back with everybody. And if you all can get that, the quicker we get feedback from people, the quicker we can share that back so you all can see kind of what's surfacing for the whole group. And then our next meeting is the 18th. So you have about 2 weeks, or 2 weeks exactly from today.
That's perfect. Yeah. And then Carol, if you and Lynette, obviously any other stakeholder information you guys have, get it back to us as quick as we can. So Ginger can update those documents. So, all right. Well, again, thanks everybody. Hope you guys have a great afternoon and we'll see you in 2 weeks. See ya.
Thank you guys.